It's a symbol, first of all, of globalization itself and the globe itself. Newspaper headlines have been calling it a mini United Nations. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Um, I personally would call that more a symbol of low-end globalization. The only problem with that is that loses all the different people in there. So I guess if I had to give it a single label, I guess I would call it something like a mini United Nations. We, from the developed world, often forget about the developing world. We might go there as tourists, but we don't know what's really going on. And we basically ignore 70 or 80% of the world's population. Now, we are all aware of China now because of newspaper headlines and the growth of the economy, but what goes on in Africa, what goes on in much of South Asia, we don't pay a whole lot of attention to that, or Latin America for that matter. We probably should. And Chunking Mansions is one way that that kind of world can be seen more closely. Most people think about globalization in terms of large multinational companies. You know, you think of McDonald's, which has outlets everywhere in the world. You think of Sony. You think of these companies with their multi-million-dollar, multi-billion-dollar budgets and their batteries of lawyers and so on. Their huge advertising campaigns. But that's not the way most people in the world experience globalization. Most people in the world don't experience what I've just called high-end globalization. Globalization of big companies. Instead, they experience low-end globalization, which consists most typically of traders, often working individually, carrying back a few hundred mobile phones in their luggage to sell in the street markets of Lagos or Nairobi or Dar es Salaam or Karachi. That's how globalization works for most of the world's people. I'm confused myself as to whether those people are victims or whether they're beneficiaries. Traders themselves always say, I'm doing a service to my country. It's wonderful. They wouldn't have the mobile phones unless I brought them. And they're right. But it's also true, as other disgruntled African politicians have told me, look, they buy a copy phone and one piece breaks after 2 weeks, another piece breaks after a week. It would have been far better if they bought an original phone in the first place. Maybe so. Obviously, this varies from merchant to merchant and from customer to customer and from phone to phone. I can't always tell, and I can't get a handle on the overall effect of these traders on their home countries. I think it's probably good in the end. I think that that trader's argument that, hey, we're bringing them globalization, probably it's better to have this, even if it is in terms of copy phones, used phones, cheap phones, shoddy goods, than not to have it at all. There's not all that much of a direct link. I mean, looking at Hong Kong, the people in Central and the stock exchange and so on have very little to do with what goes on in Chunking Mansions. Now, there's an indirect link, certainly. Certainly some of the Chinese companies on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange are making some of these goods, so there's an indirect link, but it's not a direct link. Overall, the centers of low-end globalization tend to be in places that also feature high-end globalization. Now, there are new languages. I've seen traders, go like this when they're talking about money, because it's like a speedometer. How much? 40. No, 100. 60. And I've seen them do that. More typical, though, is just using a calculator. That's probably the global language of trade. Punch in your number. So there are particular modes of speaking that the unwary need to know about. Somebody says, I'll sell you a China-made phone. They don't mean a China-made phone. They mean a copy, and you probably have to know that. Well, it's the American dream, but it's not the American dream. I mean, I talked in my lecture last night about the Hong Kong dream. It's not that different. You work hard so your kids can have it better off. The great flaw with the American dream or Hong Kong dream or the capitalist dream is, yeah, you work hard to make your kids better off, and your kids often become rather spoiled rotten, and they lose all the money. That's something we frequently see. In the United States, it's very interesting that it's immigrants who are the real motor of the society. I would almost prefer people to throw away all guidebooks and, use the internet to look up anywhere you're going. There's enough information there so you don't need a single book that will tell you what you're seeing. I mean, Lonely Planet has become a remarkably bourgeois document, that used to be for the backpackers. And Tony Wheeler's first book, Southeast Asia on a Shoestring, how to travel with nothing at all. Now, man, it's no different from any other guy. So I'm very disappointed in Lonely Planet and what it's become. But, you know, I can't criticize them because they're following their demographics. People who used to be 20-year-old or 30-year-old backpackers are now 50 and 60-year-old, you know, financiers and so on. I gave a talk a couple of nights ago at a rather wealthy Hong Kong club. And I met all these guys who were, you know, bankers and so on, who said, yeah, I stayed in Chungking Mansions back in 1980. Oh, back then I had no job and I lived there for 3 months and smoked a lot of dope. Now these guys are top financiers. And so maybe that is a link between some forms of low-end globalization and the top. That's what you see. The best thing to happen to Chungking Mansions would be if it were a known spot to look at low-end globalization, to look at the United Nations without being too known. Because if it's too known, what every guest house owner will do is raise prices, bring in the tourists. They can make more money for us than the African traders can. But if you do that, it becomes a tourist center rather than a center of low-end globalization. It loses all of its meaning for being there.